Of all of the starting zones in World of Warcraft, Teldrassil has the objectively shortest and yet most complex history to understand. By the time of Vanilla WoW, Teldrassil has only really existed for anywhere from like 2 to 4 years, but to really understand all of the choices that lead up to the creation of Teldrassil and the backstory behind it, we basically have to start 10,000 years ago in WoW lore. But before we do that, to really understand Teldrassil, we have to talk about Nordrassil. Now, Teldrassil and Nordrassil are world trees, and the Night Elves have a whole bunch of world trees, which all sort of serve slightly different purposes. But for 10,000 years, Nordrassil was essentially the heart of the Night Elf people. Right after the War of the Ancients and the Sundering that broke the world apart, Nordrassil was planted atop Mount Hyjal, and it was blessed by 3 of the dragon aspects. Nozdormu, the Bronze, whose control over time gave the Night Elves immortality, Alexstrasza the Red, whose control of life magics gave the elves strength and vitality. Quick side note here, but I actually think that it was Alexstrasza's blessing that made the Night Elves immune to getting sick. I don't know why, I had just always assumed that it was Nozdormu giving them immortality, but actually I think it was Alexstrasza. And then there's Ysera the Green, the matron of the Emerald Dream. Now, technically, I think all of the world trees are connected to the Emerald Dream, but up to that point, it had been very difficult for the Night Elf Druids to enter the Emerald Dream by themselves. So when Ysera blessed Nordrassil, she connected that world tree directly to the Emerald Dream, which made it far easier for the Night Elf Druids to come and go between the Emerald Dream and the physical realm as they wished. Now, Nordrassil would get destroyed in the Third War, which by current WoW timeline standards was a little over 20 years ago, but by vanilla WoW standards was, I think, around 5-ish years ago. And this means that the Night Elves lost all of those blessings and became mortal, were able to get sick again, so on and so forth. Nordrassil would actually end up regenerating much later, though that's not largely relevant to the history of Teldrassil. What is important, though, is that Nordrassil's destruction is what spurred the creation of Teldrassil. But the story of Teldrassil proper starts with a man named Xavius. So, 10,000 years ago, much of the Azeroth we know is actually just one continent called Kalimdor, and at this time it's dominated by the Night Elf Empire. Night Elf society is divided into the upper caste of Highborn, many of whom are proficient in spellcasting, and a lower caste of just lower-born Kaldori. Now, Xavius is one of the Highborn. He is a royal elf, and in fact, he is Queen Ajara's chief advisor. And he is also the first person on Azeroth to make contact with the Burning Legion. He is basically 100% of the reason that they ever come to Azeroth. And so he paves way for them to come through a portal, and so begins the War of the Ancients, in which the Burning Legion does what they do best and begin destroying the planet, and this causes a Night Elven rebellion to form who fight against the Burning Legion and the Highborn, since all of the Elven royals are working alongside the demons, pretty much. And this rebellion consists of many faces that may actually be pretty familiar to you, including Malfurion Stormrage and Tyrande Whisperwind. So there's a lot of stuff that happens here, but the important part is that Malfurion kills Xavius. And then Sargeras, the Titan Lord of the Burning Legion, brings Xavius back from the dead and makes him into a demon. He actually makes him into the first satyr ever. And then, well, Malfurion kills him again. Technically not kills him, but sort of gets rid of him, so he is no longer in the battle, so to speak. And this Malfurion does by turning Xavius into a tree. Things happen, the Night Elven rebellion pretty much wins the war, but the world unfortunately sunders. The Well of Eternity blows up, the continents break apart, and the ocean comes rushing in. And Azshara and her highborn loyalists would have died if not for a deal Azshara struck with N'Zoth. We see the events of this in Azshara's Warbringer short, when she would pretty much drown and die if not for N'Zoth coming to her and offering her a deal. If she allies with him, he will save her and her most loyal followers. And so she agrees, and she and the rest of the Highborn loyal to her become Naga. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we learn later that Xavius has his own deal with the old god, N'Zoth, but it's not quite clear how that deal forms. And my theory is that because he was loyal to Azshara, he was technically included in the terms of this deal when N'Zoth said that Azshara and all those loyal to her would be saved. Now, Xavius didn't get turned into a Naga. He was still technically a tree, but I do think that this is when he made his deal, or was rather included in Azshara's deal with N'Zoth. And part of why I think this too is because of wording in Chronicle. It does say that, and I quote, "Like many of Azshara's inner circle, Xavius now obeyed the will of the old gods." This is important, keep this in mind, but we're going to circle back around to it because first, we have to talk about Fandral Staghelm. So, fast forward from the War of the Ancients 10,000 years ago to the War of the Shifting Sands only 1,000 years ago. The War of the Shifting Sands is a conflict in southern Kalimdor in Silithus, in which, incidentally, another old god, Cthulhu, is pushing his Karaji forces out to fight against the Night Elves, who are at this point allied with the dragons. Fandral Staghelm is a Night Elf druid. He's a member of the druid organization, the Cenarian Circle, which is led by Malfurion Stormage. And Fandral has a son named Valstan Staghelm. And during the war, Valstan gets captured and brutally murdered in front of Fandral. There's a short story on the World of Warcraft website that basically goes into detail about this, and it's sort of graphic. A Karaji general picks up Valstan and squeezes him and actually rips him in half in front of Fandral. And suffice it to say that this sort of breaks Fandral. Watching his only son die completely changes him, and from that point onward, he is pretty much never the same. Also going on in the background of all of this is the gradual corruption of the Emerald Dream into the Emerald Nightmare. This is actually relevant to Fandral's backstory, but I'm not going to cover it in this video. What I will say is that the Emerald Nightmare was originally begun by the old god Yogg-Saron 4,500 years ago. And then later, N'Zoth took up corrupting the Emerald Dream. This will be relevant. So, jumping forward again after the Third War, so this is 20 years ago by modern WoW standards, or 5 years ago before vanilla WoW. After losing Nordrassil, Fandral wants to plant another world tree, basically to get the elves' immortality back and make up for the loss of Nordrassil. Malfurion shoots him down. He thinks this is a bad idea for a number of reasons, one of them being that Fandral sort of has a bad track record in this regard. And then, Malfurion sort of mysteriously goes missing. Spoiler alert, it was Fandral who totally attacked him and put him in a coma. So, Fandral then takes over the Cenarian Circle from Malfurion, and as their leader, pretty much forces their hand to plant Teldrassil off the coast of Kalimdor. Now, the dragon aspects had blessed Nordrassil, But in this case, they agreed with Malfurion, and they did not like that Fandral did this. They did not approve of his choice, and they thought that he was a little too arrogant in just deciding to do this. So they refused to bless Teldrassil in the way that Nordrassil had been blessed. Which means that Teldrassil's growth was not only wild and unpredictable, but that the tree itself was also highly susceptible to being corrupted. Now there's something sort of important that I didn't mention. When Fandral planted Teldrassil, he did something. Now, remember that I said Xavius is a tree, and Xavius has a deal with the old god, N'Zoth, and that N'Zoth is partially responsible for the corruption of the Emerald Dream into the Emerald Nightmare? Well, Xavius appears to Fandral as his dead son, and says that Fandral can basically have his son back if he takes a branch from the Xavius tree and grafts it onto Teldrassil. I think the idea is that Fandral was hoping that they would get immortality from Teldrassil and that he could somehow use that to bring Valstan back, but I don't know how he was expecting to do that. He wasn't really in the right frame of mind anyway. So, Fandral does this. He takes a branch from the Xavius tree and puts it on Teldrassil. Now, because Teldrassil hasn't been blessed with protection by the dragon aspects, it's susceptible to corruption. But now that it has a branch of the Xavius tree grafted onto it, that literally opens up the world tree to corruption from not only Xavius, but also N'Zoth. And at this point, the Emerald Nightmare has already been around for several thousand years, but because there's an active sort of conduit on the world tree, even though it is innately connected to the Emerald Dream, now N'Zoth can, through Xavius's connection to Teldrassil, start also corrupting the world tree by introducing the Emerald Nightmare to Teldrassil. I should specify, I say that it's N'Zoth corrupting Teldrassil, but actually I think this is completely Xavius's idea and doing. He's just using the power that N'Zoth has given him to corrupt Teldrassil. N'Zoth is all about corrupting the Emerald Dream and turning it into the Emerald Nightmare, while Xavius very specifically wanted to bring the Emerald Nightmare to the physical realm. And I think that he started with Teldrassil specifically because it was part of a 10,000-year-long revenge plot he had against Malfurion, since Malfurion killed him twice during the War of the Ancients. I don't think we know how active a part N'Zoth really had in the corruption of Teldrassil, because pretty much all of the lore surrounding it attributes the corruption to Xavius. Though I sort of imagine that N'Zoth was okay with it, because that was his end game in essence anyway. Anywho, this pretty much brings us to Vanilla WoW, where Fandral's in charge of the Cenarian Circle, Malfurion is missing, and Teldrassil is being corrupted. It's in a bad way. The Furbolgs are getting aggressive and attacking people, the Timberlings are developing tumors, even really important Night Elf creatures like the Spider Sathra are going mad. Now, Vanilla WoW doesn't really tell us what's actually up with this, nor do we really solve the problem. We just learn that Teldrassil is corrupted. It's not until the Stormrage novel that we found out that this was actually all to do with Xavius. And in the Stormrage novel, when Malfurion returns from the coma that Fandral had put him in, he is able to fully heal Teldrassil and completely purge it of corruption and get rid of the Xavius branch. Cataclysm comes out later that year, and the Night Elf Starting Zone quests, the new ones introduced in Cataclysm, sort of rehash Stormrage. It doesn't, retcon it, because a lot of the Cata Night Elf quests make reference to what Malfurion did in Stormrage, but when Malfurion fully healed Teldrassil of the corruption and got rid of Xavius. Well, technically he didn't completely, because then you as the player character have to go back and again sort of re-cleanse Teldrassil and actually get rid of the last bit of Xavius present on the world tree. In like the final quests of the zone or something, you kill like a bow of corruption that has a title that's like Remnant of Xavius. So pretty much at that point, it's by Cataclysm at the earliest that Teldrassil is completely purged of any and all corruption. But a part of me sort of wonders, given Teldrassil's connection to the Emerald Dream in general, if it wouldn't have succumbed to corruption again in Legion when the Emerald Nightmare returned. And this is entirely speculative, but we do know from the Druid class Order Hall stuff and the literal Emerald Nightmare raid that the Emerald Nightmare was pretty much attacking like any druidic connected place, and I think that Teldrassil would have been a part of that. It's just that in Legion, Xavius instead decided to attack and corrupt a different world tree entirely, Shaladdrassil, instead of Teldrassil. And then obviously we went through the raid and we actually killed Xavius for, what's our kill count now, like the 4th time? But we don't really get rid of the true source of the corruption, N'Zoth, until BFA. And at that point, Teldrassil is pretty much already burned down, so it's sort of a moot point anyway. I don't want to go too much into it getting burnt down and the War of the Thorns, because I mostly wanted to focus more on the choices that led up to Teldrassil's creation and the corruption that befell it, but that's pretty much the summarized history of Teldrassil. But there's a few more things that I want to talk about, including the nature of corruption on Teldrassil. So the Exploring Azeroth Kalimdor book, which is subject to a whole slew of controversies, says that Teldrassil was corrupted by the Void. And this makes sense because it was N'Zoth, an old god, and therefore an agent of the Void, who was pretty much responsible for Teldrassil's corruption through Xavius. But what bugs me about this is that it's wholly inconsistent with what we knew about Teldrassil's corruption leading up to that point. Pretty much every quest in Vanilla WoW says that Teldrassil had been corrupted by the Fel, by the Burning Legion, because we have quests where we have to deal with fel moss, fel cones, which are literal corrupted seeds that fall from trees, and then the literal opening cinematic for the Night Elf player character, in which it says, "The great tree was not consecrated with nature's blessing and soon fell prey to the corruption of the Burning Legion." That's pretty cut and dry that Teldrassil was being corrupted by the Burning Legion, by Fel. But Exploring Azeroth Kalimdor and pretty much our new lore regarding N'Zoth being the one who corrupted the Emerald Dream is saying that it was the Void. This part is a little bit more speculative, but I think that the way the corruption works on Teldrassil as well is consistent with the way that we've seen Fel corruption work. It's been explained to us as something sort of like radiation, super pervasive, and that it takes a really long time to wear off. That's why most orcs have green skin, even though technically the source of their corruption, Manaroth, is long gone at this point. And we learn in vanilla Teldrassil quests that corruption in Teldrassil is passed down from parent to child. They say that they discover the seeds of the Timberlings carry their parents' taint, and that there is also a quest with the spider Sathra, in which you are told that her madness threatens her offspring, though whether that means it would be passed down to her offspring or she's a literal danger to them because she's gone mad is a bit vaguer. I don't think that we know necessarily as much about how Void corruption works in this regard, though we have seen a lot of Void corruption, especially on Argus. I just think, with regards to what we know about Fel corruption, it seems to be Fel corruption that we're seeing on Teldrassil. But I have a theory, I think, that sort of reconciles and makes sense of this. And my theory essentially is that it's actually both. Because Xavius is a demon. He's a satyr of the Burning Legion. But he also had to deal with the old god N'Zoth. So it makes sense that through both his demonic nature and his deal with N'Zoth, that Teldrassil isn't just being corrupted by the Void, it is also being corrupted by the Fel. And I think it makes sense, given that N'Zoth's focus was on corrupting the Emerald Dream, that the Fel corruption of Teldrassil is a lot more physical in nature, whereas the Void corruption is really just relegated to, like, the Emerald Nightmare. That it's Xavius's physical demonic form, even though he's technically a tree, being attached to Teldrassil that is causing all of this Fel corruption to pop up. It never really explicitly says this, and I sort of wonder if the line about the Void corruption in exploring Azeroth Kalimdor was more of a retcon, but I do genuinely feel like, given the fact that Xavius is a satyr, it's probably fair to say that it is both Fel and Void corruption. So, moving on to another question that has plagued me for a really long time. So when Fandral planted Teldrassil, did he plant it on a pre-existing island? Or did he just plant it in the ocean? And mind you, planting world trees in water, there's precedent for that, because technically when Nordrassil was planted, it was planted in a lake, the Second Well of Eternity, atop Mount Hyjal. And I think I'm just going to give you the answer before we jump into the evidence. I think Fandral really just planted it in the ocean. I don't think there was an island there beforehand. So, the first mention of an island that ever popped up is from the original WoW website, made reference to an island named Kaladar that Teldrassil was grown from. It says, the druids combined their powers to grow an immense new world tree on Kaladar. They called the tree Teldrassil. But this is technically not canon because any reference of Kaladar was removed completely, both from the game and from the website. So I don't think it can really be taken as canon. And then there's also the Lands of Mystery RPG, which, again, is not canon because the RPG was decanonized, but considering that it was canon once upon a time, I sort of like to look at it as evidence to see where their thoughts were with regard to things that could have been canon or were considered canon at the time. And in the Lands of Mystery RPG, when it talks about Teldrassil, it says that Teldrassil is located on an island off the coast of Darkshore. But this one is a bit confusing. Later on in the same page, it says that Teldrassil resembles a mid-sized forested island. And moreover, that Darnassus takes up a large chunk on the western side of this island. I don't know that it's saying Teldrassil was grown on an island so much as it is just using Teldrassil synonymously with island, and that Teldrassil is both the tree and the island. But it's really weirdly confusing to parse. In the first chapter of Wolfheart, it said, Teldrassil was the name given for the island, but only as an afterthought. The island was only an extension of the true Teldrassil, a titanic tree filling most of the land, which sort of corroborates what I just said. But also, I think to me implies that there was no island there beforehand, because the island is an extension of Teldrassil, that it came from Teldrassil and was named for Teldrassil. I just don't understand why it's distinct from the World Tree when it's like part of the World Tree. Anywho. The only other reference to a possible island is in Chronicle Volume 3, when it says, Teldrassil soared high over the ocean, its trunk so large that it resembled an island. And again, I think this means that there wasn't an island there beforehand, that Teldrassil is basically the island itself. But also, incidentally, in Chronicle, there's maps. And there's maps that vary from the pre-Sundering world to the post-Sundering world. And if you look at these maps, you will notice on the map that shows the world right after the Sundering 10,000 years ago that there is an island out where Teldrassil is. And that's sort of weird, because Teldrassil wasn't really planted until after the Third War. It did not exist at this point in WoW lore. Now, I'm of the belief that this was just a map error, but there's really nothing to say that it was. I think the only thing maybe that might lend itself toward that is that this island on the Sundered World map pretty much looks exactly the same as the Teldrassil map, and maybe this is a stretch, but I really just think that it should have looked different before Teldrassil was planted on it. But mostly I want to say it's an error, because first of all, we have no other evidence of there being an island there to begin with aside from non-canon sources, and secondly, because I just personally don't think there was an island there to begin with. So I don't think this is Chronicle trying to say that there was one and that Teldrassil was planted on, like, Kaladar or something. I really do think that it was a map error. But ultimately, all of this evidence is really circumstantial, it's vague, it's difficult to parse, so I'll leave that to your discretion, whether you think maybe there was an island there beforehand, or maybe there wasn't. And that is the true summarized history of Teldrassil, from its creation to its corruption to the aftermath and its eventual unfortunate end. I did say earlier that Nordrassil had started regenerating, and I feel like there's implications or perhaps foreshadowing that Teldrassil too could in the future start regenerating, but I don't know if we'll see that honestly anytime soon in the future of World of Warcraft, but it is very possible that we might end up seeing it come back one day and fully free of any corruption whatsoever, because even if we hadn't technically healed it, either in Storm Rage or in Cataclysm quests or by killing N'Zoth, surely now it would be a healthy new tree, but at least we have a Nordrassil. So, thank you for joining me for the History of Teldrassil. I love Night Elf lore so much, and I love Fandral's backstory because he is such a tragic character. So thank you for listening to me ramble about Night Elf lore, and I hope to see you in whatever comes next.